Anton Koblova, just 20 years old, sits in silence, his hands resting on the table in a Ukrainian prison camp. The once proud soldier now wears a hollow gaze, recounting his story to an interviewer who cuts through his carefully constructed defenses. Anton insists he is not to blame. "I was just following orders," he says, the words spilling out like a rehearsed script. Yet behind him lies the wreckage of a war he chose to join, a war of occupation, aggression, and suffering. What drives a man to cross a border armed with a rifle, knowing that his orders will tear apart homes and lives? For Anton, the answer is not simple, or at least he'd like you to believe it isn't. Born in a small Russian town, he describes himself as an average young man, unremarkable grades, a factory job, and dreams of someday building a future. But when conscription called, he answered, trusting his government, his commanders, and the propaganda that framed an invasion as liberation. Now, sitting across from his captor, he tells a story riddled with contradictions. He portrays himself as a victim, a pawn of a larger system. But his hands tell a different tale. They gripped a rifle. They patrolled foreign streets. They followed orders to subjugate a nation that never asked for his help. As the interviewer listens, a new picture emerges. Beneath Anton's claims of innocence are glimpses of fear, hesitation, and guilt. "I didn't know what we were really doing," he says. "We were told we were protecting Russian-speaking people. But the truth behind those orders, violence, destruction, and occupation, reveals the hollow justification of his cause. What compels a young man to invade another's homeland? Is it blind loyalty, fear of punishment, or an inability to resist the machinery of a powerful state? And when faced with the consequences of his actions, how does he reconcile the devastation he helped create with the story he now tries to tell? This is Anton's tale, one of compliance and complicity, of lies told to oneself and to others. It's the story of an occupant caught in the crosshairs of a war he claimed was not his, but one in which he played a devastating role. As he recounts his journey, the truth unfolds. There are no bystanders in an invasion, only participants. Anton Koblova's story begins in the quiet town of Lukovitsy, a small settlement in the Moscow region that mirrors the stagnation of countless rural Russian towns. Rows of weathered Soviet-era apartment blocks line the streets, their faded facades a testament to decades of neglect. The town is unremarkable, a place where ambition rarely takes root, and survival is a more immediate concern than dreams of escape. For Anton, life in Lukovitsy was predictable. He grew up as the youngest of three brothers in a working-class family. His father, a driver for the local cultural center, spent long days navigating poorly maintained roads, while his mother managed a small neighborhood store, juggling long hours with the endless demands of running a household. They weren't destitute, but money was always tight. Every ruble mattered, and every family member had to do their part to keep the household afloat. School offered little reprieve from the monotony. Anton wasn't a poor student, but he was far from exceptional. Teachers described him as quiet and disengaged, a boy who kept his head down and rarely drew attention to himself. By the time he reached 8th grade, he transferred to a smaller rural school in search of an easier path to graduation. "It was that I didn't care," Anton later explained. "I just didn't see the point. I wasn't going to be a doctor or a lawyer, so why try?" After finishing school, Anton found work as a warehouse clerk at Yandex Market, Russia's answer to Amazon. The job was tedious, stacking shelves, filling orders, and counting inventory in a dimly lit storage facility. It paid little, offered no career prospects, and left Anton wondering if this was all life had to offer. But in Lukovitsy, opportunities were scarce, and the thought of leaving his family behind for a better future seemed both daunting and selfish. In towns like Lukovitsy, the army often feels like a rite of passage. For young men with few options, it offers a way out, a chance to escape the drudgery of dead-end jobs and prove oneself in the eyes of society. When Anton's conscription notice arrived, he didn't hesitate. The choice felt inevitable. "I thought the army would be a stepping stone," he said. "Serve for a while, earn some respect, and come back with a plan for the future." But beneath that practicality lay another, unspoken truth. Saying no was never really an option. In Russia, refusing conscription can mean legal repercussions, social ostracism, and a permanent mark against one's name. The pressure to comply is immense, not just from the government but from family, neighbors, and even friends. For Anton, enlisting was less a choice and more a social expectation, reinforced by years of state propaganda framing military service as a noble and necessary duty. Yet, even as he prepared to leave, Anton remained naive about the path ahead. He imagined routine drills, disciplined training, and camaraderie with fellow soldiers. The idea that he might one day be deployed to a foreign land, tasked with enforcing an occupation, never crossed his mind, or perhaps it did, but it was easier not to think about. Anton's decision was shaped by the forces around him: economic necessity, societal pressure, and a deeply ingrained narrative of patriotism. But what he couldn't foresee was how these forces would lead him down a path where those practical choices would take on a moral weight he was unprepared to bear. For Anton, Lukovici wasn't just a starting point. It was a place that defined him, shaped his worldview, and set the stage for the choices and consequences that would follow. As Anton left his small town for the barracks, he didn't know he was walking into the machinery of a larger conflict. A conflict that would shatter any illusions of safety or righteousness, and force him to confront the harsh reality of the role he would play in it. Anton Koblova's path from a quiet life in Lukovici to the battlefields of Ukraine was anything but straightforward. When he reported for his conscription in October 2021, he was assigned to the Strategic Missile Forces, an elite branch of the Russian military tasked with protecting and operating the country's nuclear arsenal. For a young recruit, it seemed like an opportunity to serve with purpose while avoiding the dangers of frontline combat. "I was a communications operator," Anton recalls. "We were responsible for guarding the missile sites and maintaining the security of the equipment. His unit's job was to ensure that Russia's mobile missile launchers could remain operational, even under threat. It was a routine post, far removed from the chaos of war, and Anton believed he would spend his year of service in relative safety. At first, life in the Strategic Missile Forces was as expected. Days were spent learning protocols, memorizing complex duties, and passing inspections. His commanders were strict, and the training was grueling, but Anton found solace in the predictability of it all. His focus was narrow: follow orders, complete tasks, and wait for his term to end. "We thought we were untouchable," he says. "They told us that our unit wouldn't be sent to the front. We were too important. But by the summer of 2022, the tides began to shift. Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, which had initially been framed as a swift and strategic campaign, was faltering. Reports of mounting casualties and territorial losses began trickling back to the ranks, though official channels dismissed them as exaggerations. Then came the orders. A detachment of soldiers from the Strategic Missile Forces would be redeployed to the combat zone. Anton describes the moment with a mix of disbelief and bitterness. "They told us it was voluntary," he says. "But how do you say no to a colonel? They started calling people into meetings one by one, saying we had a duty to the motherland. The pressure was relentless. Soldiers who hesitated were shamed or threatened. Those who refused outright were warned of prison sentences or demotions that could haunt them long after their service ended." What Anton had thought was a stable post suddenly felt like a trap. The promises of safety and security were unraveling, exposing the harsh realities of military life. "They told us we'd be patrolling safe areas, that we wouldn't see any real fighting," he recalls. "They said it would only be for a few months, and then we could go home. But I should have known better." None of it was true. In August 2022, Anton and 39 others from his unit were transferred to a staging area near Belgorod, close to the Ukrainian border. Officially, they were still part of the Strategic Missile Forces, but their roles had changed. They were given minimal combat training, just 2 days of live-fire exercises and basic tactical maneuvers, before being handed rifles and loaded onto transport trucks. "It was chaos," Anton says. "None of us were prepared. Some of the guys didn't even know how to load their weapons properly. The lack of preparation wasn't the only thing weighing on them. Rumors swirled among the ranks about what awaited them on the other side of the border. Some believed they'd be stationed in rare areas, providing logistical support. Others feared the worst, that they'd be thrown into the front lines with no plan, no equipment, and no support." When Anton's unit crossed into Ukraine, the reality became clear. They were assigned to secure a forested area near a contested zone, a vulnerable position prone to enemy attacks. The idyllic life had imagined in the Strategic Missile Forces was gone, replaced by sleepless nights, dwindling supplies, and the looming threat of mortar fire. "We didn't belong there," he says. "We weren't soldiers. We were just bodies to fill the gaps." As days turned into weeks, the promises that had been made to Anton and his comrades unraveled further. The safe deployment zones were anything but safe. The short-term assignments stretched on indefinitely. The voluntary nature of their service was exposed as a sham. Those who dared to question their orders were reminded sometimes violently, of their place in the chain of command. Anton admits he didn't fully understand the scale of the war when he arrived. We were told we were helping to protect Russian-speaking people. He explains that we were there to fight fascists and extremists. But the things I saw, they didn't match what we were told. Villages destroyed, civilians terrified. It didn't look like liberation. Even as doubt crept into his mind, Anton kept going. The fear of punishment, of being labeled a traitor, was too strong. He convinced himself that he had no choice, that his actions weren't his own. But as the months wore on, it became harder to believe. Each order followed, each village patrolled, each home raided chipped away at his justifications. By the time Anton was captured, he was no longer the naive recruit from Lukovice. The war had hardened him, but not in the way the military had intended. Instead of a sense of duty, he carried a growing sense of guilt and regret, a realization that the choices he'd made, whether coerced or not, had consequences he couldn't escape. As he recounts his journey, the disconnect between his initial justifications and the reality of his role becomes stark. Anton may claim he was misled, but the evidence of his actions tells a different story. The war had transformed him, not into a hero, but into a reluctant participant in an invasion he never truly believed in. Anton Koblova's deployment to Ukraine began with promises wrapped in lies, delivered with the quiet force of authority that made resistance seem impossible. It wasn't a grand call to arms or a moment of patriotic fervor. It was a calculated campaign of manipulation that used fear and duty to turn reluctant young men into instruments of war. When the orders came in the summer of 2022, Anton was still stationed with the Strategic Missile Forces, far from any battlefield. He and his fellow soldiers were told repeatedly that their unit would never be deployed to combat zones. They told us we were untouchable. Anton recalls, "Our job was too critical. We were supposed to stay back and guard the missile sites." But as Russia's war effort faltered, those assurances evaporated. Casualty reports were mounting. Territories once touted as victories were being lost, and the military machine needed reinforcements. The decision to send soldiers like Anton to Ukraine was presented as a matter of necessity, a patriotic duty. For a government desperate to sustain its invasion, these men were expendable. The process began with subtle hints, escalating into outright coercion. They started holding meetings, Anton explains. At first, it was all about how important our role would be in supporting the mission. They made it sound like we'd be heroes, helping to secure liberated areas. But these words were little more than bait to lure soldiers into compliance. When persuasion didn't work, the tone shifted. Senior officers began visiting barracks late at night, singling out individuals for private talks. Anton describes these encounters as thinly veiled threats. They'd say things like, "You don't want to be the one who lets your comrades down, do you?" Or they'd remind us that refusing orders was treason. The pressure was relentless, turning every quiet moment into a waiting game of when. Not if they would be called to sign. The paperwork presented to Anton and his peers framed their deployment as voluntary. They told us it was just a formality, he says, but everyone knew what it meant. If you didn't sign, you'd be punished. Refusal meant more than just social ostracism. It could result in imprisonment, physical abuse, or even prolonged service. The choice was no choice at all. As Anton recalls these moments, his voice carries a mix of bitterness and resignation. We were young. We didn't know how to fight back against them. They were our commanders. They had all the power. We just did what we were told. The manipulation extended beyond coercion. Propaganda was woven into every interaction, reinforcing the narrative that the invasion was a righteous cause. Soldiers were shown staged videos of supposed Ukrainian atrocities, stories of civilians in need of Russian protection. They told us we were fighting Nazis, Anton says, that we were liberators. It sounded noble at the time, but none of it was true. When Anton and his unit were finally ordered to deploy, the illusion of control crumbled entirely. The staging area in Belgorod, near the Ukrainian border, was chaos. Hundreds of soldiers were gathered there, many of them as reluctant as Anton. Supplies were scattered, communication was non-existent, and the air was thick with uncertainty. No one knew what was happening, Anton recalls. It was like they were making it up as they went along. The so-called training was little more than a charade. Over the course of 2 days, Anton and his comrades were rushed through basic drills. They were given rifles and allowed to fire a few magazines of ammunition. Some soldiers were taught to throw grenades. while others were shown how to set up makeshift defenses. It was laughable, Anton says, shaking his head. Most of us had never even handled a gun before. They just gave us the basics and hoped for the best. The equipment they were issued was similarly inadequate. Anton describes being handed a helmet that barely fit and a flak jacket with cracks in the armor. His rifle jammed the first time he used it, and his boots were worn down after only a few days in the field. They didn't care if we were ready, he says. They just needed bodies. Crossing into Ukraine was an experience Anton will never forget. The trucks rumbled through the night, carrying frightened men into the unknown. Some whispered prayers. Others tried to joke to lighten the mood. But the reality of their situation became clear the moment they reached their assigned position. They were to secure a forested area near an active combat zone, an exposed position with minimal fortifications. We thought we'd be in a safe zone, Anton says. Instead, we were right in the middle of it. The first night in Ukraine was a harsh awakening. With no proper trenches, Anton and his comrades were told to dig their own defensive positions using small, dull shovels. The ground was frozen, and every attempt to carve out a shelter was met with frustration. By dawn, they had little more than shallow pits to shield them from the elements and enemy fire. It felt like they were setting us up to fail, Anton says. We were exhausted before the fighting even started. When the first mortar shells landed near their position, the panic was immediate. Soldiers scrambled for cover, some diving into their makeshift holes, others running blindly into the woods. The sounds of explosions and gunfire filled the air, a chaotic symphony of war that none of them were prepared for. It was pure chaos, Anton recalls. No one knew what to do. We were just trying to survive. Over the coming days, the systemic disregard for human life became impossible to ignore. Supplies were rationed to the point of starvation. One food packet split among 3 men. Water was scarce and often unsafe to drink. Medical care was a distant hope, with injured soldiers left to suffer or fend for themselves. It was like they didn't care if we lived or died, Anton says. We were just numbers to them. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers whispered among themselves about abandoning their posts, about deserting the army entirely. But the fear of punishment kept them in line. We heard stories about guys who tried to run, Anton says. They were caught, beaten, and sent back to the front. We were trapped. The promises of safety and purpose that had lured Anton into service were gone, replaced by the stark reality of war. The manipulation tactics, the propaganda, the coercion. It all came down to one brutal truth. Anton and his comrades were expendable. They were pawns in a larger game, sent to die for a cause they barely understood. As Anton reflects on those early days, his voice carries the weight of disillusionment. We thought we were helping, he says, but all we did was destroy. Villages, homes, lives. Everything in our path was left in ruins. And for what? I still don't know. Anton's deployment wasn't just a journey into a foreign land. It was a descent into a system that valued power over humanity, lies over truth, and control over the lives of its own people. For Anton, it marked the beginning of a transformation, from a naive recruit to a man haunted by the consequences of his actions. Anton Koblova's early days on the front lines were a descent into chaos and despair, a far cry from the promises of safety and purpose had been fed before deployment. The reality of war unraveled quickly, stripping away any illusion of control or righteousness. The first position Anton's unit was tasked with holding was a patch of forest near a contested village. It wasn't a strategic stronghold. It was a poorly fortified outpost with barely enough cover to shield them from incoming fire. The forest was cold and damp, the ground littered with broken branches and patches of mud. At night, the temperature dropped to near freezing, and the soldiers huddled in their shallow foxholes, their breath visible in the pale moonlight. We didn't have proper gear, Anton recalls. Our coats were thin, and most of us didn't even have gloves. Every night felt like it could be our last. Their first assignment was deceptively simple: secure the nearby village, rumored to be a supply point for Ukrainian forces. The briefing was rushed, with few details beyond the command to clear the area. Anton and his comrades moved cautiously, their boots crunching against frost-covered ground as they approached the outskirts of the settlement. The village was eerily silent, its streets deserted, its windows shattered. The remnants of a once thriving community now stood as a ghost town, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The soldiers fanned out, entering homes one by one. Inside, they found traces of life abruptly interrupted, half-eaten meals left on tables, children's toys scattered across floors, family photographs still hanging on the walls. Anton felt a pang of unease as he stepped over a doll lying face down in the dirt. It was like the people had vanished into thin air, he says, but you could feel that they hadn't gone willingly. As Anton's group reached the center of the village, the ambush began. The first shot rang out, shattering the oppressive silence. A sniper, hidden in the shadows, fired with precision, striking one of the soldiers in the chest. Panic erupted as the men scrambled for cover, their training, or lack thereof, betraying them in the heat of the moment. We didn't know where the shots were coming from, Anton recalls. Everyone was yelling, running in different directions. It was chaos. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but the damage was done. By the time the sniper retreated, 2 soldiers lay dead, and another was bleeding profusely. Anton's lieutenant, visibly shaken, made the call to withdraw, leaving their injured comrade behind. We couldn't carry him, Anton says, his voice trembling. He was too heavy, and we were too exposed. He'll never forget the way he screamed for us to come back. That moment haunted Anton for days, but it was far from the last horror he would witness. The missions that followed were an endless cycle of fear and destruction. Each village they entered bore the scars of war: burned out homes, hastily dug graves, and families hiding in basements. The soldiers were under orders to search every building and detain anyone suspected of aiding Ukrainian forces. But the line between suspicion and innocence blurred with each passing day. One mission stands out in Anton's memory. His unit had been sent to a small farming settlement to root out alleged partisans. As they swept through the village, they encountered an elderly woman standing in her doorway, clutching a photograph of her family. She begged them not to take her son, who was hiding inside. She was crying, saying he wasn't a fighter, that he was just a farmer, Anton recalls. But our orders were clear. If he was hiding, he was guilty. The soldiers dragged the young man from the house, ignoring his mother's desperate pleas. He was bound, blindfolded, and loaded onto a transport truck, his fate unknown. Anton didn't intervene. I told myself it was my place to question orders, he says. But deep down, I knew what we were doing was wrong. The strain of these missions began to take its toll. Anton's unit operated on minimal sleep, often going days without proper food or water. The constant threat of ambushes kept them on edge, and tempers flared under the weight of exhaustion. Arguments broke out over the smallest things: who got the last piece of bread, whose turn it was to stand watch. We were like animals, Anton says. The war brought out the worst in all of us. As the weeks dragged on, Anton's perception of the war shifted. The narrative of liberation had clung to was shattered by the reality of the suffering he witnessed. Villages weren't being saved. They were being destroyed. Civilians weren't welcoming them as heroes. They were cowering in fear. And the promises of safety and purpose had been replaced by a single, unspoken truth. Survival was all that mattered. The turning point came during a botched assault on a fortified Ukrainian position. The mission was doomed from the start. The plan, hastily thrown together by their commanders, involved crossing an open field under the cover of night and storming the enemy trenches. Anton and his comrades knew it was a suicide mission, but refusal wasn't an option. The advance began in silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen grass. But as they neared the halfway point, the night erupted with gunfire. Anton dove to the ground, his heart pounding as bullets whizzed overhead. Around him, soldiers screamed and fell, their bodies crumpling in the dirt. The lieutenant yelled for them to keep moving, but the order was drowned out by the cacophony of war. Anton froze, paralyzed by fear. In that moment, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. He turned and crawled back toward the tree line, abandoning his comrades to their fate. I couldn't do it, he says. I couldn't keep going. All I could think about was getting out of there alive. By the time Anton reached safety, half of his unit was dead, and the mission was declared a failure. Survivors were reprimanded, accused of cowardice and incompetence. The dead were buried in shallow graves, their names quickly forgotten. For Anton, the experience was a breaking point. I realized then that we were nothing to them, he says. Just numbers to be replaced. They didn't care about us, only about the results. The weight of his actions, or inaction, became unbearable. Anton's silence in the face of civilian suffering, his compliance with unjust orders, and his decision to abandon his comrades all pointed to a single painful truth. He wasn't a victim of the war. He was a participant. Now, as he sits in a Ukrainian prison, recounting his experiences, Anton struggles to reconcile the man he wanted to be with the man he became. He claims he had no choice, that he was just following orders. But the scars of the war he helped wage tell a different story, a story of complicity, cowardice, and the devastating cost of doing nothing. Anton's time on the front lines wasn't just about survival. It was about the choices he made, or failed to make, when faced with the horrors of war. And those choices, whether he admits it or not, will define him forever. Anton Koblova's time on the front lines was marked by fear, survival, and complicity, but also by fleeting moments of doubt and the faint stirrings of resistance. While he tried to justify his actions as necessary or inevitable, cracks in his resolve began to show. These moments, brief and often suppressed, reveal a deeper struggle between his conscience and the oppressive forces of war. Anton recounts his first real act of defiance during a mission to secure a small village suspected of harboring Ukrainian partisans. His unit was ordered to search every house and detain anyone deemed suspicious. By now, this had become a routine operation, one Anton had carried out multiple times without question. But this village felt different. It wasn't empty like the others. As they approached, they saw children playing in the dirt roads, women hanging laundry, and elderly men tending to small gardens. It was a scene of life, fragile but intact. I remember thinking, these people aren't enemies, Anton says. They weren't hiding weapons or planning attacks. They were just trying to live. As his comrades stormed into the houses, yelling and overturning furniture, Anton hesitated. He stood outside, gripping his rifle tightly, unable to force himself to move. I told myself it wasn't my place to decide, he says, but for the first time, I didn't want to follow the order. This hesitation didn't go unnoticed. A senior soldier barked at Anton to join the search, calling him a coward when he didn't respond immediately. Under pressure, Anton eventually entered one of the houses. Inside, he found a young woman clutching a baby, her face pale with fear. She begged him not to hurt them, her voice trembling. I just stood there, Anton says. I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. I couldn't. Moments like these began to weigh heavily on Anton, eroding the justifications Head constructed to shield himself from guilt. Yet, his doubts didn't translate into open rebellion. The fear of punishment, of standing out, kept him in line. He recalls a fellow soldier, Sergei, who openly questioned their mission during a briefing. Sergei, a father of two, had grown increasingly vocal about the orders they were receiving. He kept saying, "Why are we doing this?" These people didn't ask for our help, Anton says. At first, the officers ignored him, but then they started making an example of him. Sergei was assigned the most dangerous tasks, sent to the front during every patrol. When he refused to comply with an order to burn down a civilian structure, he was beaten and dragged away. We never saw him again, Anton says. They told us he was reassigned, but we all knew what that meant. This incident had a chilling effect on the rest of the unit. If Sergei, a seasoned soldier and a family man, could be erased so easily, what chance did the others have? Anton admits that Sergei's fate reinforced his own silence. I told myself I wasn't like him, he says, that I couldn't afford to resist. But the truth is, I was scared. The moments of doubt continued to creep in, though Anton worked hard to suppress them. During one mission, his unit was ordered to block a main road to prevent civilian vehicles from leaving the area. The justification was that the cars might be carrying enemy fighters or supplies. It didn't make sense, Anton says. We weren't checking the cars, just stopping them. Families with kids, old people, they weren't a threat. As the hours dragged on, a line of cars formed, their drivers pleading with the soldiers to let them pass. Anton watched as an elderly man in a battered truck approached the barricade, his wife sitting silently beside him. The man offered bread and water, hoping to bribe his way through, but the soldiers laughed and turned him away. I wanted to tell them to let him go, Anton says, but I didn't. I just stood there. These small acts of complicity began to haunt Anton. At night, he lay awake in his trench, replaying the day's events in his mind. The faces of the civilians had wronged. The screams of the soldiers had abandoned. They became a permanent fixture in his thoughts. I started to feel like a ghost, he says. I wasn't living. I was just existing, following orders and waiting for it to end. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal raid. Anton's unit had been tasked with clearing a residential building that was allegedly being used as a sniper's nest. As they entered, they found a family huddled in one of the apartments, a father, mother, and two young children. The father begged the soldiers to leave them alone, swearing they had nothing to do with the fighting. But the officer in charge ordered the building set on fire, citing precautionary measures. I couldn't do it, Anton says. When they handed me the lighter, I just froze. I looked at the kids, and I couldn't move. Another soldier took the lighter from his hand and carried out the order. As the flames engulfed the building, Anton turned away, unable to watch. I wanted to run, he says, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. During his interview, Anton tries to frame these moments as evidence of his humanity, as proof that he wasn't like the others. But the interviewer challenges him, pointing out that hesitation isn't resistance. You didn't stop them, the interviewer says. You didn't save those people. You just watched. Anton doesn't respond, his eyes fixed on the ground. The truth is undeniable. While Anton's doubts revealed cracks in his resolve, they never translated into meaningful action. His moments of refusal were small, fleeting, and ultimately inconsequential. He may not have lit the fires or pulled the trigger, but his silence made him complicit. As Anton reflects on these moments, he struggles to reconcile his actions with his conscience. I thought I didn't have a choice, he says, but now I wonder if I could have done more. His story is one of internal conflict, of a man caught between fear and morality, and of the devastating consequences of inaction. Anton Koblova's capture was not the result of a heroic last stand or a calculated surrender. It was a moment born of desperation and abandonment. By the time he found himself in the custody of Ukrainian forces, Anton was a soldier in name only, stripped of purpose and loyalty by the very institution that had sent him to war. It happened during yet another ill-fated mission, this one to reinforce a crumbling defensive position on the outskirts of a small Ukrainian village. Anton's unit, already depleted and demoralized, had been ordered to hold the line against a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The plan was vague, the resources inadequate, and the leadership absent. They sent us in with no backup, no supplies, and no idea of what we were facing. Anton recalls, we were just bodies to fill the gaps. The battle began at dawn, with Ukrainian artillery pounding the Russian positions. The ground shook as explosions ripped through their defenses, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. Anton and his comrades huddled in their makeshift trenches, clutching their rifles and praying for the barrage to end. When it finally did, the real assault began. Ukrainian forces advanced with precision, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Anton's unit, by contrast, was chaotic and disorganized. Orders were shouted but not followed. Soldiers ran in every direction, some firing blindly, others simply fleeing. Anton stayed low, too afraid to move. I didn't know what to do, he says. I just kept my head down and hoped it would stop. As the enemy drew closer, Anton realized that many of his comrades were gone. Some had been killed, others had deserted. His lieutenant, the only officer present, had disappeared entirely. We were on our own, Anton says. There was no one left to lead us. In the chaos, Anton made a choice that would define the rest of his life. With no clear orders and no reinforcements in sight, he dropped his rifle and raised his hands. I couldn't fight anymore, he says. I didn't see the point. We weren't defending anything. We were just dying. The Ukrainian soldiers who approached him were cautious but not cruel. They searched him for weapons, then motioned for him to follow. Anton expected the worst. I thought they would shoot me, he admits. Or maybe beat me like our officers did when we stepped out of line. But instead, they offered him water and a blanket, gestures of humanity that he hadn't experienced in weeks. As Anton was led away from the battlefield, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his captors and his own military. They treated me better than my commanders ever did, he says. They didn't yell at me or threaten me. They didn't call me a coward. They just did their job. In the hours that followed, Anton was processed as a prisoner of war. He was questioned, photographed, and given a meal. Simple but filling. The Ukrainian soldiers didn't taunt him or humiliate him. Instead, they asked about his family, his home, and how he had ended up in their country. It was strange. Anton says, they seemed more interested in who I was than in what I had done. The treatment Anton received as a prisoner stood in stark contrast to the way he had been treated by his own military. In Russia's armed forces, soldiers were expendable. They were beaten for minor infractions, sent into battle with inadequate supplies, and abandoned when they were no longer useful. Anton recalls one soldier in his unit who had been injured during training. Instead of receiving medical care, he was told to walk it off and later discharged without support. We were nothing to them, Anton says. Just tools to be used and thrown away. In captivity, Anton found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. He was relieved to be alive, but the guilt of surrender weighed heavily on him. He worried about how his family would react, whether they would see him as a failure or a traitor. He thought about his comrades who had died, and those who had fled, and wondered if he had made the right choice. I kept asking myself if I could have done more, he says, if I should have stayed and fought, but I knew it wouldn't have changed anything. The Ukrainian soldiers who guarded Anton didn't see him as a hero or a villain. To them, he was just another young man caught in the machinery of war. They treated him with a level of dignity that surprised him, offering him moments of conversation and understanding. One soldier, barely older than Anton, told him about his own family and how he had joined the army to protect them. It made me realize that we weren't so different, Anton says. We were both just doing what we thought we had to do. Despite this humanity, Anton knew he wasn't free from judgment. The interviews with his captors were pointed, probing the contradictions in his story. When Anton claimed he was just following orders, they asked why he hadn't refused. When he said he didn't know the truth about the war, they pointed out the evidence he had seen with his own eyes. They didn't let me hide behind excuses, Anton says. They made me confront the things I didn't want to admit. These conversations forced Anton to reflect on his role in the war, on the choices he had made, and the ones he hadn't. He began to see himself not as a victim, but as a participant in something far larger and more destructive than he had ever imagined. I realized that surrendering wasn't just about saving myself, he says. It was about facing the truth. Anton's capture marked the end of his time as a soldier, and the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by orders and obedience, but by accountability and reflection. In the custody of his enemies, he found a level of humanity that his own side had denied him, and in that humanity he began to confront the moral weight of his actions. As Anton sits in his cell, recounting his story, he still struggles to reconcile the man he was with the man he wants to be. His surrender was a moment of survival, but it was also a moment of clarity, a chance to see the war for what it truly was, and to begin the painful process of understanding his place within it. Anton Koblova had always imagined that being captured by enemy forces would mean unspeakable hardship. The stories told by Russian commanders painted a grim picture. Ukrainian soldiers would torture prisoners, starve them, humiliate them, and treat them like animals. Anton carried these fears with him as he surrendered, preparing for the worst. But the reality he encountered in Ukrainian custody was something entirely different, and far more unsettling for a man who believed he was a victim of circumstance. When Anton was first brought to the prisoner processing center, he braced himself for mistreatment. He expected blows, shouted insults, or worse. Instead, the Ukrainian guards spoke to him in calm, measured tones. They ordered him to sit, searched him for weapons, and asked if he was injured. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, Anton says. I thought they were being nice just to catch me off guard. The first surprise came when he was offered food and water. It wasn't much. A piece of bread, some soup, and a bottle of clean water, but it was more than had received in weeks from his own military. They gave me a blanket too, Anton recalls. It was the first time in a long time that I felt warm. The kindness unsettled him. He couldn't reconcile it with the enemy he had been taught to hate. Over the next few days, Anton began to realize that his captors weren't the monsters he had been led to believe. The guards treated him and the other prisoners with a level of professionalism that bordered on compassion. They followed strict procedures, ensuring that the prisoners were fed, allowed to rest, and even given basic medical attention. One guard, noticing Anton's limp, called a medic to examine his ankle, a sprain he had ignored during his time in the field. I didn't understand why they cared, Anton says. They were supposed to hate us, weren't they? The contrast between his expectations and the reality of captivity forced Anton to confront uncomfortable truths. He began to reflect on how his own commanders had treated him and his fellow soldiers. Beatings for minor infractions, neglect when they were injured, and orders that treated them as expendable. It was a stark difference from the structured, humane treatment he now received. It made me think about who the real enemy was, Anton admits. Was it the people who captured me, or the ones who sent me to die? But even as he adjusted to the conditions of captivity, Anton struggled with feelings of self-pity. He lamented the loss of his freedom, the uncertainty of his future, and the stigma he would face if he ever returned home. I kept thinking, why me? He says. Why did I have to be the one to surrender? Why couldn't I be one of the lucky ones who got away? The interviewer, sitting across from Anton, does let these statements go unchallenged. You call yourself unlucky, they say, but you're alive, aren't you? You were fed, given medical care, and treated with dignity. Can you really call yourself a victim here? Anton's response is hesitant. "I didn't ask for any of this," he says. "I didn't want to go to Ukraine. I didn't want to fight." But the interviewer presses further, pointing out that while Anton didn't choose the war, he made choices within it, choices that contributed to the suffering of others. "You followed orders," they say. "You searched homes, detained civilians, and pointed your rifle at people who had done nothing to you. Do you think the people in those villages felt lucky?" These questions force Anton to reflect on the deeper implications of his actions. His initial narrative, that he was a victim of circumstance, powerless to resist, begins to fray under scrutiny. He tries to justify himself, claiming he had no choice, that refusal would have meant punishment or death. But even he seems unconvinced by his own words. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he says softly. "I was just trying to survive." Life in captivity continued to challenge Anton's perception of himself. He watched as Ukrainian guards interacted with civilians who came to the facility to deliver supplies or check on loved ones. He overheard conversations about families separated by the war, about homes destroyed and lives upended. For the first time, Anton began to see the human cost of the conflict from the other side. They weren't faceless enemies anymore, he says. They were just people trying to protect what was theirs. Despite this growing awareness, Anton struggled to take full responsibility for his role in the war. He often retreated into self-pity, lamenting the conditions of captivity rather than grappling with the reasons he was there. He complained about the monotony of the meals, the lack of privacy, and the long hours of boredom. "I felt like I was being punished," he says, "but I didn't think I deserved it." The interviewer's pointed commentary offers a counterpoint to Anton's complaints. "You talk about punishment," they say. "But isn't this what accountability feels like? Isn't this the price of the choices you made?" These words linger with Anton, forcing him to confront the gap between his perception of himself and the reality of his actions. Over time, Anton's experiences in captivity began to chip away at his self-pity. He formed tentative bonds with other prisoners, sharing stories and commiserating about their shared predicament. He listened to the accounts of Ukrainian guards who had lost family members in the war, their grief evident even in small gestures. "It made me realize how much pain this war has caused," Anton says. "Not just for us, but for everyone." The humanity he encountered in captivity stood in stark contrast to the dehumanization he had experienced in the Russian military. It forced him to ask difficult questions about loyalty, morality, and the true nature of victimhood. "I used to think I was the victim," he says, "but now am not so sure." As Anton reflects on his time in captivity, he acknowledges that it has been both a punishment and a revelation. The harsh treatment he feared never materialized. Instead, he was given a chance to see the war through the eyes of those his actions had harmed. "They treated me better than I deserved," he admits. "Better than I treated others." Anton's story is one of contrasts, between his expectations and reality, between his self-image and the truth, and between the inhumanity of war and the surprising humanity of those he once called enemies. His time in captivity hasn't absolved him of his choices, but it has forced him to confront them. And in doing so, it has opened the door to a deeper understanding of what it means to truly be accountable. Anton Koblova's interrogation began with routine questions, the kind he expected, his name, rank, and unit. But as the hours passed, the interviewer's focus shifted. They weren't just gathering information. They were dissecting Anton's story, peeling back the layers of his self-constructed narrative. What emerged was a portrait of a man caught between denial and guilt, his claims unraveling under the weight of scrutiny. The interviewer started with simple inconsistencies. "You say you didn't know why you were sent to Ukraine," they said, flipping through their notes. "But you also mentioned that your officers gave you orders to secure specific villages. How do you reconcile that? You knew enough to follow those orders, didn't you?" Anton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "We were just following commands," he replied. "They told us we were liberating people." The interviewer's response was swift. "Liberating them by raiding their homes? By pointing rifles at unarmed civilians? Tell me, Anton, did those people look liberated to you?" Anton hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. "I didn't have a choice," he said finally. "If I refused, I would have been punished, maybe even killed." The interviewer leaned forward, their tone sharp. "And what about the civilians you detained? The ones who pleaded with you, begged for their families? Did they have a choice?" This question seemed to hit Anton like a blow. He looked down, avoiding the interviewer's gaze. "I didn't think about it that way," he admitted quietly. "We were told they were helping the enemy." "And you believed that?" The interviewer pressed. "Even when you saw them with your own eyes?" Elderly men, women, children. Did they really look like enemies to you? Anton's silence spoke volumes. The interviewer continued, their voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. You talk about not having a choice, but you made choices every day. You chose to follow orders, to stay silent, to look the other way. Those were your choices, Anton. The interrogation delved deeper, focusing on specific incidents Anton had mentioned in passing. One story, in particular, caught the interviewer's attention. The raid on a small village where Anton's unit had detained several civilians. The interviewer asked him to describe the event in detail. We were told there were partisans hiding there, Anton began, his voice trembling. Our orders were to search every house and detain anyone who looked suspicious. I didn't want to, but you did. The interviewer interrupted. You dragged people out of their homes, tied their hands, and handed them over to your commanders. Is that correct? Yes, Anton admitted, barely above a whisper. But I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't lay a hand on them. The interviewer's expression hardened. You think that absolves you? You stood by while your comrades terrorized those people. You didn't stop it. You enabled it. Do you understand the difference? Anton's defenses began to crumble. He shifted from excuses to self-pity, lamenting the position he had been placed in. I was scared, he said. I didn't know what else to do. They would have punished me if I refused. The interviewer was satisfied. Fear doesn't justify what you did, they said firmly. Do you know what the civilians you detained must have felt? They were terrified, Anton. Terrified of you. Of what you represented. And you're sitting here telling me you were the victim. Tears welled in Anton's eyes as the weight of the words sank in. The interviewer pressed further, recounting another incident Anton had mentioned. The burning of a residential building during a raid. Anton had claimed he hadn't participated, that he had refused to carry out the order. But the interviewer wasn't letting him off so easily. You say you refused, they began. That you handed the lighter to someone else. But you didn't stop them, did you? You didn't tell them it was wrong. You just stood there and watched. I didn't have the power to stop them, Anton protested, his voice cracking. I didn't want it to happen, but what could I do? You could have spoken up, the interviewer shot back. You could have done something, anything, to make it harder for them to follow through. Instead, you chose silence. That silence is complicity, Anton. As the interrogation continued, Anton's narrative of victimhood unraveled entirely. His claims of ignorance, of being misled, were met with pointed questions that revealed the contradictions in his story. The interviewer reminded him of the destruction he had witnessed, the suffering he had enabled, and the lives he had impacted. You knew what was happening, they said. You may not have pulled the trigger or lit the fire, but you were there. You allowed it to happen. By the end of the session, Anton was visibly shaken. The walls of self-defense he had built around himself had been torn down, leaving him exposed. He no longer tried to deny his actions outright, instead grappling with the reality of his choices. I thought I was doing what I had to, he said softly. But maybe I was just trying to survive. The interviewer's final question cut to the heart of Anton's dilemma. You've talked a lot about survival, they said, but at what cost? You survived, Anton. But how many others didn't because of what you did, or didn't do? Anton had no answer. For the first time, he was forced to confront the truth he had been avoiding, that his role in the war, however reluctant, had made him complicit in its horrors. The interrogation didn't just expose the inconsistencies in his story. It revealed the deeper, more troubling reality of his participation in an unjust war. And for Anton, that realization was perhaps the harshest punishment of all. Anton Koblova remained silent for a long time after the interviewer's final question. His hands rest on the table, his gaze fixed on a crack in the wall. The question lingers in the air. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? For someone who has spent so much time justifying his actions, this question isn't easy to answer. Because to answer it truthfully would require confronting not just his actions, but his very identity. This moment encapsulates the broader dilemma at the heart of Anton's story, the tension between who we are and who we aspire to be, between the choices we make under pressure and the choices we know we should make. It's a tension that defines every conflict, every act of oppression, every war. And it's a tension that reminds us of the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Anton's silence reflects the silence of countless others caught in similar circumstances. Wars throughout history have been fought not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people. People who, like Anton, were swept up by forces they didn't fully understand. The foot soldiers of these conflicts often share the same story. They were just following orders, just trying to survive, just doing what they were told. But the impact of their actions, the destroyed villages, the displaced families, the countless lives lost, cannot be dismissed as mere circumstance. The war in Ukraine is a modern tragedy, but it is also a continuation of a much older story. The story of power and domination, of systems that dehumanize both the oppressor and the oppressor and the oppressed. Anton's role in this story is small but significant. He is one of thousands of soldiers sent to enforce an invasion under false pretenses, taught to view their targets as enemies and their actions as necessary. What makes Anton's story resonate is not its uniqueness but its familiarity. His excuses, fear, coercion, ignorance, are the same excuses used in wars across history. They are the same justifications used by soldiers in every unjust conflict, from colonial conquests to genocides. And they force us to confront a difficult truth. These excuses may explain Anton's actions, but they do not absolve him of their consequences. The interviewer's voice cuts through the silence. You say you don't know if you would have had the courage to resist, they say. But courage doesn't always mean standing up in defiance. Sometimes it means refusing to participate. Sometimes it means taking a small stand, even if it feels insignificant. Anton shifts in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The idea that he could have done something, that his inaction was itself a choice, seems to weigh on him. I thought I was doing what I had to, he says. But now I see that what I had to do was the same as what I should have done. This distinction between duty and morality, between survival and humanity, is central to understanding Anton's story. His role in the invasion wasn't just about following orders. It was about the choices he made within those orders. Each decision, no matter how small, contributed to the suffering of others. And each decision, no matter how coerced, was still his to make. The broader reflection extends beyond Anton's individual story to the system that shaped him. The Russian military, as Anton describes it, is a machine designed to suppress dissent and enforce conformity. Soldiers are trained not to question but to act, to view themselves as tools rather than individuals. This dehumanization doesn't just harm the civilians they encounter. It harms the soldiers themselves, stripping them of their ability to think critically, to empathize, to resist. But the system isn't limited to the military. Anton's journey began long before he was drafted. It began in the schools that taught him to equate patriotism with obedience, in the media that framed the invasion as a righteous cause, in the community that saw refusal as betrayal. The forces that led Anton to Ukraine are the same forces that have fueled countless conflicts throughout history. Nationalism, propaganda, fear. The interviewer leans back in their chair, their tone softening. You're not the only one, Anton, they say. You're part of something bigger. Something that's been happening for centuries, but that doesn't mean you're not responsible. It just means that responsibility is shared. This idea of shared responsibility is crucial. Anton's story is not just about him. It's about the systems that enabled his actions, the leaders who orchestrated the invasion, and the societies that allowed it to happen. It's about the collective choices that create wars and the collective silence that sustains them. As Anton reflects on these words, his gaze shifts from the wall to the interviewer. What happens now? He asks, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now is up to you, the interviewer replies. You have a chance to think about what you've done, about what kind of person you want to be. And maybe, just maybe, you can help others see what you've seen. Anton nods slowly, the weight of his journey finally settling on his shoulders. His story is far from over, but the direction it takes from here will depend on whether he can confront the truths he has spent so long avoiding. The human cost of the war in Ukraine cannot be measured in numbers alone. It is felt in the grief of families torn apart, the loss of communities erased by violence, and the scars, both visible and invisible, left on those who survive. Anton's story is one of those scars. It is a reminder that wars are fought not by machines but by people, each making choices that ripple outward, shaping the lives of others in ways they may never fully understand. As the conversation ends, the interviewer leaves Anton with one final thought. The choices we make matter, Anton. Even when we feel powerless, even when the odds are against us, what we do defines who we are and what kind of world we leave behind. Anton doesn't respond, but his silence is different this time. It's not the silence of avoidance or self-pity. It's the silence of a man beginning to reckon with himself. His story, like the war itself, is far from over, but it serves as a call to reflect, not just for him, but for all of us. to question the systems we are part of, to resist the forces that seek to dehumanize, and to remember that even in the darkest times, we have the power to choose. Through Anton's eyes, we see the cost of silence. And through his story, we are reminded that silence is never neutral. It is a choice, and it carries consequences. The question now is, what will we choose?